The night of February 28, 1915, a frozen field near the village of Saint-Éloi in Belgium. 100 men of the Princess Patricia's regiment lie in the mud, their faces smeared with burnt cork. Their boots are wrapped in sacking so the frozen ground won't answer them with sound. They are about to do what no one on the Western Front has done before. They will cross no man's land at night, of their own will, and they have no intention of holding what they take. And here is the detail this video exists for. Most of them will fight in the German trench. A few men will not stay in the trench at all. Those men will find a wooden ladder. Because the German front line in 1915 was not a ditch, it was a roof. Beneath it, down the steps, sometimes 10 meters underground, ran the dugouts, timber-lined rooms with bunks, a stove, a table, a lamp. The German army built them better than anyone on the front, because the German army intended to stay. It was the one place on the Western Front where a man could sleep. A 150mm shell lands 20 meters away, and down below, you're drinking coffee. The entire German system of defense rested on a single promise made to every soldier. Up there you die, down here you live. That night, the Canadians went down the ladder. By morning, the raid was over. 30 yards of German trench destroyed, the Germans killed, the Canadians back behind their own parapet before dawn. The British had not done this. The French had not done this. The Germans, still convinced they were fighting a war of maneuver, had never thought of it. And no one at that moment understood what had actually happened, because what was invented there was not the raid. A raid is a tactic. It can be copied in a week. What was invented there was something that cannot be copied, because it is not a technique. It is the breaking of a promise. 3 years later, German soldiers on the Canadian sectors will sleep above ground, under the open sky, under the artillery, in the mud that is killing them, voluntarily, because they will not go back down. How did one small group of men with revolvers, clubs, and a sack of grenades take an entire army's only refuge away from it? They didn't destroy it. They didn't bury it. They poisoned the very thought of it. To understand that, you have to go down that ladder with them, and you have to begin with the man who goes in first and knows that he'll be the first to die. Part 1. The Roof and the Cellar. Forget everything you've seen in the movies about trenches. The movies show you a line, mud, duck boards, sandbags, men in helmets peering over the parapet. That's true, but it's true in roughly the same way that saying a house is a roof is true. The German position was 2 stories. Up top, the fighting line, the fire step, the machine gun nests, the sentries. Up there, something can come down on you at any minute. Up top, a man doesn't live. Up top, a man stands watch. Down below, the dugout. And here begins the difference almost nobody talks about. A British dugout in 1915 was, as a rule, a niche cut into the trench wall and covered with a sheet of corrugated iron. A German dugout was a work of engineering, a staircase of 20 steps, 30, sometimes 40. Timber framing, sometimes 2 exits, sometimes electric light. On the Somme in 1916, the British pounded the German positions for a week with 1.5 million shells. And on the 1st of July, the Germans came up out of the earth and met them with machine guns. The dugout had survived a week-long bombardment. Do you understand what that means? From the standpoint of artillery, the German dugout was unbeatable. And precisely for that reason, it was mandatory. German doctrine was built on it. Keep the minimum number of men on the surface, the rest go below. Ride out the barrage underground, come up when the infantry advances. It was the best defensive system on the front, and it worked for 4 years, but every system has a price, and it isn't paid in money. The price of the German dugout was this. It has 1 staircase, 1 entrance, narrow, straight. Whoever stands at the top of that staircase owns everything below it, and whoever is below owns nothing. He is in the dark. He's sleeping or eating. His rifle is standing in the corner. A rifle is awkward in a dugout. It's long, 5 feet with the bayonet fixed. He can't see who's on the steps. He sees only a silhouette against a gray square of sky. The Germans knew this, of course, and they solved it the way the German army solved everything, with doctrine. A sentry at the entrance, a machine gun enfilading the trench along its length, wire, flares, artillery ranged in advance on fixed grid squares. The logic was simple and entirely correct. If the enemy never reaches the entrance doesn't matter. The whole structure rested on a single assumption, that the enemy behaves like an enemy, that he comes in daylight, that he comes after an artillery preparation that gives you a week's warning, that he comes in a crowd you can see, that he wants to take the trench and therefore will fight for the trench up top where he's expected. Not one of those assumptions describes 100 men with blackened faces who came silently over the parapet at 3 in the morning and who don't want your trench at all. By the end of 1915, the Canadian Raiders already had a name for themselves, not a heroic one: body snatchers. Because the object of a raid was not the trench, not the casualties, not the glory. The object was a live German. Intelligence needed a prisoner to learn what unit was opposite, what fresh division had come up, where a blow was being prepared. A live German was worth more than 100 dead ones. Now put two things together. You need a live German, at night, fast, because in a minute, the German artillery will speak and you will die in someone else's trench. Where are the live Germans at night? Not up top. Up top there are 2 or 3 sentries. All the rest, the whole company, are below, asleep. The Germans had built the Canadian Raiders a perfect room, warm, lit, with one way out, full of sleeping men whose weapons are standing in the corner. All that remained was to find a man who would agree to go down the staircase first. Part 2. The Craft. By 1916, the Canadian Raid had stopped being an improvisation. It had become a production line, and that production line had specialists. The party that went out through the wire at night was divided into groups, and each group had its job. Some cut the wire, others blocked the trench to the left and the right. They went in as stoppers, so the Germans in the neighboring bays couldn't come to the rescue. Others set a Lewis gun up on the parapet and fired down the length of the communication trench. Others carried the explosives to bring down a dugout, blow a mortar, destroy a machine gun nest. And there was one more group, the smallest one. Their job was to go down. Their weapons were not a soldier's weapons. A rifle is useless in a dugout. It's long, the bayonet catches on the timbering, it takes 3 seconds to reload, and you don't have 3 seconds. So they carried what works at arm's length: a revolver, a sawn-off shotgun, a trench knife, a sharpened entrenching tool. They used it like an axe, a club studded with nails, a knuckle duster, and grenades. Always grenades. Here is what it actually looked like, and I'm not going to dress it up. 2 men come up to the entrance. One flattens himself against the trench wall beside the opening. Not in front of it, never in front of it, because if they're awake down there, they shoot upward. The first man throws a grenade down the stairs. He waits. An explosion in an enclosed space is not about fragments. It's about pressure. In an underground room, the blast wave has nowhere to go. It slams into the timbers and comes back. The men below are deafened, blinded, bleeding from the ears. Then the Canadian goes down, sometimes firing ahead of him, sometimes simply knowing there is no longer anyone left to fire at. The task was to bring one out alive. If that worked, you dragged him up and back across no man's land. If it didn't, you left no one behind. This was a craft, not heroism, not cold blood, not madness. A craft with its own rules, and the first rule was this: get in, do it. Get out in 20 seconds before the German artillery lands on the spot. Every second over that is paid for by your own men up top, lying in the wire. And now we come to the most uncomfortable place in this story. It has to be approached head on. What was done with a prisoner who slowed the withdrawal? The historian Tim Cook documented this for years, not from memoirs, but from the letters, diaries, and reports of the Canadians themselves. And the picture that emerges is an ugly one. Prisoners were killed. Not always, not everywhere, but often enough that their own officers wrote about it, and often enough to alarm the high command. Cook quotes a lieutenant who calmly, in his own hand, describes running a foot of cold steel into prisoners. And alongside that, a second figure, one you have to hold in your head at the same time as the first. Over the course of the war, the Canadian Corps took more than 42,000 Germans alive. Both figures are true. And this whole story lives in the space between them. What started the vendetta, where the fury came from, we'll get to that. But first you have to look at the result from the other side of the wire. Because the Germans weren't reading Tim Cook's footnotes. The Germans simply woke up in the morning and found that 2nd Company was 12 men short and that the 13th was gone entirely. He'd been carried off. Nobody has ever made a film about the men who did this work. Their names aren't in the textbooks. A like takes 1 second, and it keeps those names afloat a little longer. That's it. Back to it. Part 3. The Broken Promise. Put yourself in the place of a German infantryman in 1916 opposite the Canadians. You're exhausted. You haven't slept properly in 3 weeks. Up top it's wet. It's cold. Things come down on you, and there's nowhere to lie down. Down below is the only place in your universe where you can take your boots off. And 3 nights ago, men disappeared from the next company along. You don't know how it happened. Nobody heard shooting. The sentry was at his post. They found him in the morning. A grenade went down the stairs. 12 men. 1 was carried off alive. And you know he's sitting in a British headquarters right now, telling them about your division. Now night comes. You're sent below to rest. You're standing at the top of the staircase, and you make the calculation that every man on this stretch of front is making at this moment, every night, on his own, without anyone ordering him to. Down below it's warm and dry, and I won't see who comes in. Up top a shell can kill me, but I'll hear the shell. That's it. That's the whole mechanism of this video. Artillery warns you. You hear the gun, you hear the whistle, you drop, you live. A man gets used to artillery because artillery is honest. It gives you a second. A grenade thrown down into the room where you're sleeping gives you nothing. And here is what follows from that, without a single additional man being killed. Men stop going down. They sleep up top, in the funk holes, in the mud, with one eye open. In a week, the company is 150 exhausted men who haven't slept. In 2, the sentries start firing at any rustle, and all night the sector crackles with continuous nervous fire that hits nothing but gives away every position on it. The German command responds the way a good army responds. More sentries, more wire, more flares, more machine guns firing along the trench. Artillery onto no man's land on a schedule every night at nothing in particular, just in case. And every one of those measures costs men and sleep. More sentries means fewer men resting. Flares all night means nobody sleeps. Artillery fired blind means your own wiring parties can't get out to the wire. Look at what has happened. How many men did the Canadians kill on a raid? 10, 20, nothing. Against what a single battery does in a morning, and they paralyzed a battalion. It wasn't the Canadians who did that. That's the whole elegance of it, and the whole horror. Nobody was running the Germans into the ground. The Germans were running themselves into the ground because every individual man was making an entirely rational decision, and the sum of 1,000 rational decisions is called the disintegration of a defense. The Canadians didn't destroy the German dugout. They did something worse. They turned it into what it had been all along, and what nobody had thought about, a hole with one way out. And by 1917, German staffs began doing the thing armies only do when something is very badly wrong. They began reinforcing sectors simply because, according to intelligence, the Canadians were opposite. Not because the Canadians were attacking, because the Canadians were there. Part 4, where the fury came from. Now, the honest part. Because if you stop at the previous minute, what you have is a story about Canadian ingenuity, and that isn't all this story is. The 22nd of April, 1915, at Ypres, a yellow-green cloud rolls toward the French colonial units. Chlorine, the first mass gas attack in the history of war. 2 French divisions cease to exist. A hole 8,000 yards wide opens in the Allied front. To the left of that hole are the Canadians. They have no gas masks. They have no instructions. They have the Ross rifle, which jams in the mud. In 48 hours, the 1st Canadian Division loses 6,000 men. 2,000 of them dead. The line holds. And somewhere in that chaos, a sergeant by the name of Band goes missing. No body is ever found. And in May, wounded Canadians in the rear hospitals begin telling the same story, that the Germans took a Canadian sergeant alive and crucified him to a barn door with bayonets. The Times prints it on the 10th of May, 1915. Whether it happened has been argued over for 100 years. A post-war Canadian commission found no evidence. Some historians consider it black propaganda. But for this story, it doesn't matter whether it was true. What matters is that the Canadian soldiers believed it, and they fought on that belief for another 3.5 years. That's where the vendetta came from. That's why the party going down into the dugout didn't always come back with a prisoner. That's the context in which a lieutenant writes home about a foot of cold steel, and nobody puts him in front of a court-martial. And here, I'm obliged to tell you something most videos on this subject won't. This was a crime. Killing a man who is surrendering or disarmed is a war crime, and it was one in 1915 as well. The Hague Conventions existed and had been signed. The fact that the Germans used gas does not cancel that. The fact that the Germans may have crucified a sergeant does not cancel that. Fury is an explanation. Fury is not a justification. And at the same time, the other half of the same verdict, which can't be thrown away either, 42,000 prisoners. The Canadian Corps took more Germans alive than any other formation of comparable size. That is not compatible with the image of the Canadians didn't take prisoners. Which means the truth is more complicated, and the truth, by all appearances, is this. The reputation began doing the work instead of the violence. A German soldier in a dugout hears a grenade on the steps. He knows, because it's talked about up and down the front, that it's Canadians up there, and that the Canadians, they say, don't take prisoners. What does he do? He does not reach for the rifle in the corner. He puts his hands up faster than he would have put them up for anyone else, because the only chance he has left is to become a prisoner immediately, while the decision hasn't yet been made for him. The terror the Canadians had sown in order to kill began bringing them men alive. Tim Cook's figures and the figures in the intelligence summaries meet at exactly this point. And this is probably the darkest sentence in the whole story. Their reputation as murderers was the most effective prisoner-taking instrument on the Western Front. Part 5. The Legacy and the Verdict. The war ended. The trenches were filled in. The men who had gone down those staircases went back to farms in Saskatchewan and offices in Winnipeg. And for the most part, they told no one anything. The craft remained. The 21st of December, 1943. Ortona, on the Adriatic. German paratroopers have turned an Italian town into a machine. The streets are blocked, the doors are booby-trapped, every angle is covered, and the Canadians, the loyal Edmonton Regiment, the Seaforth Highlanders, stop using the streets. They blow a charge through the wall of an upper story, throw a grenade through the hole, and go in from above, clearing the house downward, floor by floor. Do you hear it? Grenade first, man second, top to bottom, never bottom to top. It's the same drawing, the same law. The German in a cellar in Ortona is sitting in exactly the place his father sat in a dugout outside Arras, in a room with one entrance, with a grenade coming in from above, thrown by a man he cannot see. 25 years and one war between those two scenes. The method is identical, because what the Canadians found in 1915 wasn't a tactic. They found the vulnerability in the very idea of shelter. Every shelter is a room. A room has an entrance. There is always one entrance, or almost always, and the man standing over the entrance is always stronger than the man beneath it. This isn't about Germany. This is about geometry, and geometry doesn't sign armistices. Now the verdict, and it's a double one, and I'm not going to smooth it in either direction. On one side, this is one of the cleverest things the infantry of that war ever did. 100 men with blackened faces inverted the entire logic of an army's defense without spending a single extra shell. They took the enemy's sleep away from him, and in war sleep costs more than ammunition. They turned the best dugout on the front into its worst weakness without altering a thing about it, simply by looking at it from the other end of the staircase. On the other side, there are things in this work that no elegant phrasing washes out. Deafened men in an underground room, raised hands that didn't help, officers' letters written in an everyday tone, and the fact, and there is no getting around it, that the reputation which brought prisoners in was built on the men who were never allowed to become prisoners. I'm not going to pass the verdict for you. I'll only say that both sides of this account are real, and that anyone who remembers one and forgets the other isn't remembering history. He's remembering a version. They had names. The 100 men of Princess Patricia's who went over the parapet in February 1915 with burnt cork on their faces. Odlum, who in November of that year took 170 volunteers to the Petite Douve and came back having lost 2. The nameless men who were first to press themselves against the wall beside a black opening, pull the pin and count to 3, knowing they were going down there regardless. And the German infantryman we will never name, who one night looked at the staircase leading down into warmth and light and sleep and stayed up top in the mud under the shells. He was right. That's what the Canadians took from him. Not the trench, not his life. The right to walk down his own staircase. If your grandfather, your great-grandfather, or your uncle served in the Canadian Corps, in a raiding party, in the Scouts, in the Engineers, write it in the comments. Which unit, what he told you, and, more importantly, what he refused to talk about. That is exactly what isn't in the archives. Subscribe. There are a lot more stories like this one. They're lying buried under the famous battles.